Another day, another video, and today I'm going to be making some profiteroles. So like Eclairs, profiteroles use a choux pastry, not a choux pastry, but a choux. So there's a couple tips and tricks to watch out for, which I'm going to be sharing with you along the way. But that being said, let's get into making the actual dough. Now there's a bunch of different choux pastry recipes out there from a bunch of different people, and when it comes down to it, they're all very similar. They all use the same 5-6 ingredients. There's just a difference in like the measurement of some of the ingredients, but in the end they're basically all the same. So this is just one of those recipes that I've used a couple of times and I like it, so I'm just sticking with it. So for the choux pastry that I'm using today, you're going to need 250 milliliters of water, 60 grams of butter, 200 grams of all-purpose flour, a good pinch of salt, 1 tablespoon of sugar. If you want your choux pastry to be savory, then I would suggest not adding any sugar into it at all. But since I'm making profiteroles, I want the actual choux pastry when it's baked to have a little bit more flavor. And then you're also going to need 3 to 5 eggs. So depending on all your other ingredients and the size of your eggs, you're going to have to add, maybe a little bit more egg, maybe a little bit less egg. So you're going to need 3 to 5 eggs in order to get the consistency that you want in the end. Now to make the actual dough, all you're going to do is add your water, butter, sugar, and salt into your pot and let that come to a boil on high heat. Once that has come to a boil, you're going to add in your flour and start mixing it together using a wooden spoon until it's come into a nice dough ball. And then you kind of want to burn off or cook off the flour taste for about 1 to 2 minutes just by moving it around in your pot, even though it's come together into a dough. That will just help kind of get rid of that floury taste. And that's the first part. So once the bottom of my pot has kind of like a nice brown layer of the leftover of the dough pretty much, that's a good sign for me that I've let it cook long enough. So I'm just going to transfer this into a separate bowl just to make sure it doesn't stick to the bottom of my pot or keep cooking. And I'm just going to let this cool off for 5-6 minutes and then I'll see you then. Now the dough has already cooled down a lot, but just to make sure that the eggs won't scramble when we add them, I'm going to just add the dough into my KitchenAid and just let the KitchenAid mix it around for another 5 minutes just to get some cold air into the dough. Now this would also be a good point to start preheating our oven to 200 degrees Celsius or 392 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that our dough has pretty much cooled off, we can start adding in our eggs one at a time, making sure that each egg is very much so incorporated before we add the next egg in. So this part's also really important because you kind of have to keep an eye on the consistency of your dough because you don't really know how many eggs you have to add in the end to get the consistency that you need. So it's pretty safe to say that you're going to need at least 3 eggs. Unless you have like really oversized eggs, then you might just need 2.5 eggs. But I'll show you after each egg what it should look like and then the end consistency it should be as well. Yeah, so that being said, you can also do this by hand. Just prepare to get a good workout in because this part takes a while and you're just gonna be standing there folding and whisking that egg in for about 20 minutes probably, or at least 10-15 minutes. Yeah, so I'm going to be using my KitchenAid because we know we're lazy and impatient, and this, saves up my 2 arms and I don't need to work out, so win-win. Alright, so I'm just going to start adding in my eggs. Now I ended up using 4 eggs in my dough, but No, I got it now. Now I ended up using 4 eggs in my dough, but you might need a little bit more, a little bit less. You're just gonna have to see. So when you look at it, you kind of want the dough to be a little bit glossy, and you also want it to be thin enough that you can pipe it and not be struggling trying to get the dough out of your piping bag. But then again, you want it to be thick enough that when you do pipe it, it's not gonna run out everywhere. So I think this is a rather good consistency. It's kind of a little bit spreadable. It's still rather thick, like it holds its shape. Now we're just gonna go ahead and start piping it onto our prepared baking sheets. So you want to use a round piping tip, and if you don't have a round one, you could just use a plastic bag as well, or you could use one that has like the little ridges on it. Then the profiteroles will just have those ridges on it in the end, so they're not going to be as like round as a regular profiterole. So when you're filling your piping bag, you want to make sure to not overfill it. It'll just give you more struggles than you want, and it'll just hurt your wrist even more when you're piping it. So I would say fill it maybe to just under halfway, not even, and then just refill it as you go. When you're piping, all you're going to do is apply pressure to get a nice circle and then pull up. And you want to space your profiteroles out quite a bit because they do expand a lot when they're baking. Now I usually apply pressure for around 3 seconds to get kind of this size. But again, if you want your profiteroles to be a little bit bigger, make bigger blobs. If you want them to be really small, make really tiny blobs. It's your call. Use some water and my finger just to pat down the tops to make sure that they're nice and round and smooth. Now these are just going to bake for 20 minutes, and whatever you do, do not open the oven door. If you do, all the hot air that is inside our profiteroles is going to escape and they will become really flat, which is not what you want. So if you do want to check on them, just turn on the oven light. If they're looking nice and golden brown, they're done. If not, let them in there for another couple of minutes. The profiteroles are done baking and I've let them cool down completely. So as you can see, they've completely puffed up and become these super nice little round balls. Now some of them that are piped on a little bit weird, they kind of puff up in weird different shapes, like this one or this one. These are the best because they become the snacks while you actually fill the rest of your profiteroles. Let's talk about how to fill these profiteroles now. So there's a couple different ways that you could do this. So one of the easiest ones, which is what I'm going to do, is just using whipped cream. Another one is using a diplomat cream, which is basically a combination of a custard and whipped cream together. Or you could also fill it with ice cream. Do whatever you want to do. I'm lazy, so I'm just going to do whipped cream instead of making a custard and then making a diplomat cream. But I can imagine that tastes just as good. Now I just whipped up around 400 milliliters of heavy cream with 2 teaspoons of sugar and put it into my piping bag. So the piping tip that I'm using is this really long kind of nozzle that's kind of slanted at the front. That'll allow me to go into the bottom of the profiterole and pipe it full of cream. So that being said, all we're going to do is we're going to grab our profiterole. If it already has a little hole, you might as well just use that hole or find a good spot to stick your nozzle into. And then all you're going to do is apply some pressure and fill it up with whipped cream. So you're going to feel the profiterole also get a lot heavier. And once you feel like it's pretty much full, that's when you know it's good to go. For this one, for instance, you can see that some of the cream is starting to come out, so it should be full. Now we're just going to do this with every single profiterole, or until we run out of whipped cream. Now that they're all filled, I'm going to just put them into the fridge while I prepare the ganache. For the chocolate ganache, you're going to need 150 milliliters of heavy cream and 150 grams of dark chocolate. All we're going to do is heat our cream up to a boil on the stove and then pour it over our chocolate chips and let that sit for 5 minutes before giving it a good whisk. Now there's a couple different ways that you can serve your profiteroles. So you can either just pile these onto a plate or inside of a bowl and drizzle that ganache over it. Or you can take each individual profiterole and dip it into your ganache and then just let it drip on a little tray before putting them into the fridge. I've allowed the ganache to set in the fridge for about 10 minutes so they're not that sticky. So at this point they're ready to be eaten. So you can also freeze your profiteroles if you want and then let them thaw out either in the fridge or on the counter for a few minutes before you eat them. Or you can just eat them like this and store them in the fridge for a couple of days.